Hey guy, welcome back to Sleep Among Titans, where we drift through strange and quiet corners of the past, perfect for listening before you sleep. Tonight we're going through what you might call a career guide in reverse. A handy 15-step list on how to completely ruin your life and get accused of witchcraft in the Middle Ages. The surprising part, you barely had to try. Imagine the world is cold, the nights are long, and your village is small. Every misfortune from a failed crop to a simple toothache needs a culprit. And the easiest culprit is always the person who is just a little different. Over the next couple of hours, we'll meet the people behind these absurd accusations. Ever known a woman who was just a little too good with herbs? We'll talk about her. What about that grumpy old lady who just wanted some peace and quiet with her cat? Oh, she's definitely on the list. We'll even investigate the high crime of having your butter fail to churn properly. It's a story that is both comical in its logic and deeply tragic in its outcome. So as we settle in, if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, do consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It lets the algorithm know that history, even in its strangest forms, is worth remembering. Now let the whispers begin. Our journey starts not with a curse, but with a kindness that curdled into suspicion. So to really understand the almost comical absurdity we're about to witness, we need to zoom out a little. You have to remember this paranoia didn't just appear out of nowhere. Europe was going through a phase, a very cold phase to be exact, the beginning of the Little Ice Age. Think of a damp gray winter that overstayed its welcome for about a century. When you're cold all the time and the crops are failing for the 5th year in a row and your child has a fever, the local doctor can't explain, you get desperate. You start looking for someone to blame. After all, you can't exactly punch a famine in the face, but you can find a person who looks like they might be friends with it. It's a very human, if terrible, coping mechanism. And right on cue, a book arrives, a monstrous international bestseller called the Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. It was a masterpiece of motivated reasoning, written by a German churchman who seemed to have a very, very public grudge. This book was essentially a deeply researched theological guide on how to prove that the person you already disliked was in fact guilty of cosmic crimes. It offered infallible signs, like a supposed mark from the devil, which conveniently could be any mole scar or birthmark the investigator decided it was. This book basically gave the whole of society a permission slip for its worst instincts. Have you ever come across a piece of media or a book that just seemed designed to make people angry or afraid? Let me know in the comments below, because this book weaponized fear. It gave people a holy reason to be suspicious of the woman who knew too much about herbs or the one whose business was doing just a little too well. With this climate of fear hanging in the air like a permanent fog and this so-called guidebook in hand, the stage was set for tragedy. All it needed were its unwitting actors. And our first one was a woman whose only crime was trying to help. Her name was Isolde. And her story begins, as so many tragedies do, with good intentions. For years, Isolde was the quiet beating heart of her small community. She was the one you went to when the world of official university-trained doctors, with their theories about the four humors and their expensive questionable cures, was either too far away or too costly. Isolde's methods were older, grounded in the earth itself. She knew the forest behind the village better than any hunter. Not for the deer trails, but for the quiet places where the yarrow grew its feathery leaves, a promise to staunch a bleeding wound. She knew the exact stretch of the riverbank where the willow trees would offer up their bark, a key to soothing a raging fever. Her hands were a map of her life's work, calloused from the grinding stone she used to crush roots, stained faintly green from countless leaves, yet gentle enough to check a baby's fontanelle, or apply a soothing poultice to a burn. She was both a pharmacist and a physician, her knowledge passed down from her mother and her mother before that. An ancient, unbroken chain of female knowledge. And for this, she was respected, deeply. She was also the village midwife. In the dark of night, when a woman's cries echoed in the narrow lanes, it was Isolde's calm, steady voice that cut through the fear. She had brought dozens of the village's children into the world. She knew the rhythm of childbirth, the moments for patience, and the moments for action. She had seen it all, and her presence was a comfort, a bulwark against the terror and pain of labor. And why wouldn't they trust her? She was one of them, her successes plain to see in the faces of the children running through the mud. But the ground, as we've discussed, was shifting. The air was colder, the mood darker, and a reputation built over a lifetime can be undone in a season. The first crack in her armor was a woodsman named Gregor, a towering strong man who fell from a tree, a branch piercing his side. His family brought him to Isolde. She cleaned the wound, packed it with moss she'd boiled to purify it, and applied a compress of comfrey, the plant they called knitbone. She did everything her learning had taught her, but the wound was deep, and a poison was already working its way through his blood. A fever took hold that no willow bark could break. Gregor died 3 days later, his wife's wails echoing louder than Isolde's quiet words of comfort. At the funeral, the whispers began, soft like the rustle of dry leaves. She used to be so good at this. What changed? The second crack was a baby. The first child of a young couple madly in love. The labor was long, difficult. Isolde was there for 2 straight days, barely sleeping, using every technique she knew. But when the baby finally came, it was silent. A perfect, beautiful little boy who never drew a breath. The mother's grief was a storm, a hurricane of pain. And in the eye of that storm, a target was needed. It's a strange sort of accounting, isn't it? Where 24 healthy babies are celebrated, but one stillbirth becomes a debt that someone has to pay. Suddenly 2 deaths felt like a pattern. The whispers grew louder, bolder. They were no longer questions, but accusations. The logic of fear, armed with the new fashionable paranoia of the Malleus Maleficarum, began to reinterpret Isolde's entire life. Her encyclopedic knowledge of herbs. It was no longer ancestral wisdom. How could one woman know so much? Clearly she wasn't just finding the plants. She was being told where to look. Perhaps she had secret conversations with the forest itself. Her calm demeanor during a difficult birth. It wasn't professional experience. It was an unnatural lack of emotion. A sign that she felt no human empathy because she was something else. Her garden, which was always so lush and green, that wasn't due to hard work and good soil. No normal garden grew that well. Surely it was being fed by unnatural means, its roots tangled in dark packs. The very skills that had made her a pillar of the community were now being presented as evidence for the prosecution. Her competence became her crime. The simple, boring idea that she had learned all this from her mother, who learned it from her mother, was suddenly a far less compelling story than her having a secret late-night meeting with a cloven-hoofed instructor in the woods. That's the thing about a good conspiracy theory. It's always more exciting than the truth. The final bitter irony. The people who once begged for her help now crossed the lane to avoid her. Mothers would pull their children close when she passed, making signs against the evil eye. The door that was once always open for the sick and the scared was now perpetually closed. No one knocked. No one called for her. Isolde the healer was quarantined by suspicion. Her gift had become her curse. She was left alone with her knowledge in a village that had decided it would rather suffer than be saved by a woman it no longer trusted. Isolde was condemned for being too involved, too skilled, too visible. But what happened to those who chose the opposite path? The ones who lived on the fringes from the very beginning, shrouded in silence, asking only to be ignored. As we'll soon see, in a world that is hunting for witches, trying to be invisible can be just as dangerous. And that brings us to Elara. If Isolde's crime was being at the center of everything, Elara's was living on the absolute fringe in a state of carefully curated invisibility. Or so she thought. Her cottage was the last one on the path out of the village, huddled under an old oak tree as if it were trying to hide. Time had worn the world down around Elara. Her husband was long gone, taken by a winter cough decades ago. Her children were grown and had moved to the city, their visits becoming as rare as a warm day in November. So Elara had shrunk her world down to the size of her small cottage, her overgrown garden, and the company of a lazy black cat named Ash. Her days were a quiet, repeating loop. She would mend old clothes with fingers stiffened by age, her lips moving silently as she counted the stitches. She would tend to her small patch of leeks and herbs, her back bent in a permanent arch from years of labor and the nagging pain of lumbago. and she would talk. She would talk to Ash, who was an excellent listener, mostly because he was usually asleep. She would talk to the sputtering fire. She would talk to herself, her voice a low, raspy hum, because the silence in the cottage was often too loud to bear. She didn't want anything from anyone. No fame, no fortune, no business. All she wanted was to be left alone to live out her remaining years in peace. But in a suspicious village, a desire for privacy is an admission of guilt. Invisibility, it turns out, is a magnet for the imagination. And so the villagers began to write a story about Elara with her as the villain. Every mundane detail of her quiet, lonely life was meticulously gathered and twisted into a sinister new shape. Let's start with the most obvious crime: she lived alone. In a world where family and community were everything, a woman living by herself was an anomaly, an uncomfortable, loose thread in the social fabric. Why did she have no one? The simple, sad answer was loss and time, but the more exciting whispered answer was that she preferred other kinds of company, unseen company. And this brings us to the cat, Ash. His crime was primarily being a cat, and being black, which was an unforgivable aesthetic choice. Now, if you've ever owned a cat, you know their job description is fairly straightforward. Sleep demand, food stare into the middle distance at things you can't see, and occasionally trip you on the stairs. To the villagers, however, Ash wasn't just a pet. He was a familiar, a demon in disguise sent to be Elara's spy. His ability to appear silently in a doorway wasn't stealth. It was supernatural teleportation. His habit of staring at nothing wasn't him tracking a dust mote. It was him observing a spectral visitor. His purr wasn't a sign of contentment. It was the low grinding rumble of a demonic engine. Then there was the muttering. Because Elara was hard of hearing, she often spoke her thoughts aloud to keep them straight. One afternoon, while mending a shirt, she couldn't find her needle. A villager walking past her open window heard snippets on the wind. Where did it go? Prick it. In the dark. Lose it. The villager didn't hear a confused old woman. They heard an incantation, a curse being woven against someone using a needle in the dark. The story was in the tavern by nightfall. Her bad back, the one that made her stoop, that wasn't the dull ache of age. It was a posture of deference, a constant, subtle bow to the unseen masters she served. But the final, undeniable piece of evidence was the one she was born with. On her shoulder, just below her collarbone, was a splotch of darker skin, a birthmark. To her, it had just always been there, a part of her like a freckle. But to an eye trained by the Malleus Maleficarum, it was something else entirely. It was the devil's mark, the spot where Satan had branded his new servant, sealing their pact. The book claimed such marks were insensitive to pain, and you can just imagine the quiet terror of that idea taking root in a neighbor's mind. The thought of a test with a sharp pin becomes a terrifying possibility. Suddenly, a simple patch of skin becomes the star exhibit in a cosmic trial. The tipping point, as it so often is, was a bucket of milk. One morning, a farmer was leading his cow past Elara's cottage. She was outside squinting into the morning sun, her eyes not what they used to be. To the farmer, her squint looked like a malevolent glare aimed directly at his prized cow. That evening, his milk soured. It was, of course, a hot day. The bucket probably wasn't clean. There were a dozen logical reasons, but logic doesn't stand a chance against a good story. Elara had cursed his cow. The proof was right there in the sour milk. And just like that, her transformation was complete. Elara, the woman who wanted nothing more than to be invisible, was now the most dangerously visible person in the village. She was a blank canvas onto which everyone could paint their deepest fears. Her loneliness wasn't sad, it was sinister. Her silence wasn't peaceful, it was plotting. She was no longer just an old woman. She was a witch. Elara's tragedy was being different, a collection of unfortunate, misinterpreted details. But what if you were exactly the same as everyone else, just unlucky? What happens when misfortune strikes your farm, but not your neighbors? That, as we will now see, is when the quiet, acidic poison of envy begins its work. That brings us to the quiet, acidic poison of envy. For this, let's meet two farmers, Heinrich and Klaus. Their fields shared a fence, but that's where the similarities ended. Klaus's land seemed blessed. His wheat grew tall and golden, his cows were fat and content, their coats glossy in the sun. His fence posts were straight, and his gate never sagged. He was a man who it seemed could drop a seed on a rock and find a flower garden the next morning. Heinrich's land, on the other hand, was stubborn. He worked just as hard, woke just as early, and prayed just as fervently. But his wheat was thinner, paler. His cows seemed perpetually unimpressed with their lot in life. His fence had a permanent weary lean to it. He was a man locked in a constant losing argument with the earth itself. Every morning, Heinrich would look out over his own struggling fields, and his gaze would inevitably drift across the fence to Klaus's effortless bounty. And every morning, the same question would burn in his gut, a question as old as time. Why him and not me? It's a dangerous question because the answer is rarely satisfying. Random chance, better soil drainage, or a more diligent rotation of his crops don't make for a very good villain. It's much more comforting to believe that your neighbor's success isn't a result of his good fortune, but a result of your misfortune. A misfortune that is being actively aimed at you. For weeks, this feeling festered in Heinrich, a low-grade fever of resentment with no outlet. The outlet arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a dairy product. The scene is the kitchen. Heinrich's wife, Matilda, is at the butter churn. She's been at it for hours. Her arms ache, her brow is slick with sweat. The churn, a simple wooden plunger in a tall pot, has become her mortal enemy. She plunges it up and down, up and down. The cream inside sloshes around defiant, refusing to break. It remains a liquid, thin and mocking. In her mind, this isn't a failure of fat content or temperature. This is an act of deliberate supernatural rebellion emanating from the churn itself. Heinrich comes in from the fields, his shoulders slumped with the weight of another discouraging day. He sees his wife, her face flushed with frustration and the useless soupy cream. And in that moment, all the free-floating resentment about his fields, about Klaus, about his general lot in life, snaps into a single sharp point of focus. This is part of it. The curse against him is not just in his fields. It has invaded his home. It's in his dairy. It will not turn, Matilda says, her voice tight with impending tears. Who have you spoken to today? Heinrich asks, his voice low and serious. His mind is already working not as a husband, but as an investigator. And so the kitchen becomes a courtroom. They sit at the rough-hewn table, a modern-day cold case squad, trying to pinpoint the source of the supernatural attack on their butter. They meticulously go over Matilda's day. Who did she see? Who did she talk to? And then they land on it. The argument at the market. Matilda had been buying yarn from a widow named Agnes. Agnes was known for two things: making the best yarn in the village and possessing a tongue that could sour milk from 50 paces. They had haggled over the price, as people do. The haggling became an argument. Matilda accused Agnes of charging too much. Agnes accused Matilda of being a cheapskate. It was a thoroughly normal, unpleasant market day squabble. In the heat of the moment, Agnes had thrown her hands up and said, "May your fingers be as tight as your purse," before storming off. At the time, it was just an insult. But now, in the eerie glow of the butter that wouldn't turn, the memory is re-examined. It's played back, slowed down. Agnes's angry scowl becomes a witch's hateful glare. Her sharp words were not a retort. They were an incantation. A curse. The case was solved. It was a classic case of confirmation bias 1,000 years before the term was invented. Now that they had their suspect, everything about Agnes became sinister evidence. Her bread always rose so perfectly, didn't it? Her chickens laid more eggs than anyone's. She was a widow, but she seemed fine. Too fine. She managed her affairs with a competence that was, now that they thought about it, deeply unsettling. The web of flimsy proof woven from envy and frustration was complete. Heinrich and Matilda looked at each other, a grim sense of relief passing between them. Their suffering wasn't their fault. It wasn't random. It was the work of Agnes the Market Witch. They had found the villain for their story of misfortune, and in doing so, they felt a little less like failures themselves. The fact that their justice would mean the complete destruction of another woman's life was a secondary concern. They had condemned a woman not for her actions, but for a few sharp words and the crime of being a little too good at making yarn. But what if a woman didn't need to say anything at all? What if her very success, her independence, her quiet accumulation of wealth was in itself the most damning curse of all, that is a different kind of threat entirely, and one the world was even less prepared to handle? That brings us to a different kind of threat entirely, one the world was even less prepared to handle. For this, let us step out of the dirt-floored cottages and into the bustling workshop of a woman named Greta. Greta's story isn't about misfortune or deliberate isolation. It's about the most subversive and terrifying thing a woman could be in this era: successful. In a world where a woman's domain was expected to be the hearth and the home, Greta's domain was the workshop and the marketplace. The air in her building didn't smell of baking bread, but of lanolin wood polish and the sharp, earthy scent of dyes. The sound wasn't the cry of a baby, but the rhythmic, hypnotic clatter-thump of half a dozen looms weaving wool into wealth. She was a widow. Her husband, a master weaver, had been a kind but uninspired man who died suddenly from a summer fever. The expectation from the town's other merchants, all men of course, was clear. Greta would do the decent thing: she'd sell the workshop to one of them for a modest price, take her widow's portion, and quietly find a new husband to manage her affairs. It was the proper, predictable, and respectable path. Greta, however, did not take the respectable path. To the shock of everyone, she announced she would be running the workshop herself. The men of the Weavers' Guild chuckled at first. A woman running a business. They gave her 6 months tops. What they failed to realize was that for years, while her husband had handled the looms, Greta had been handling the one thing he couldn't stand: the books. She could read, write, and do sums in her head faster than any of them could on paper. She understood supply, demand, and profit margins with an instinct they mistook for feminine intuition. Within a year, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. She secured better prices for raw wool than her husband ever had. She developed a new vibrant blue dye that no one could replicate. Her workers were loyal because she paid them on time and treated them fairly. The Greta Weaver mark became a sign of undeniable quality. And that is when the whispers started. Because in their world, this simply didn't add up. Her success was an affront to the natural order of things. So they began to craft a new narrative, an explanation that made sense to their bruised egos. First, there was her uncanny financial acumen. Her books were always perfectly balanced. Her profits were consistent. It was unnatural. The competing merchants, seeing their own customers flock to her, found it much easier to believe her ledger was balanced by demonic imps who offered very competitive rates than to admit a woman simply understood math better than they did. The idea of supernatural insider trading was far more palatable than the idea of being outsmarted by a widow. Then there was her refusal to remarry. Suitors came, of course. Men who saw her thriving business as a handsome dowry. They were drawn to her wealth, but also disturbed by her power. They wanted to marry her, to control her, to bring her and her workshop back under male authority where it belonged. Greta politely but firmly refused them all. To the village, this was baffling. Why would a respectable woman choose to be alone? It wasn't seen as independence. It was seen as a sign that she wasn't truly alone. If she had no earthly master, she must be serving a master from a much warmer, more sulfurous climate. And finally, there was her literacy. Her ability to read was once a private, useful skill. Now it was seen as a key to forbidden knowledge. What was she reading in those quiet hours after the workshop closed contracts and shipping manifests? Yes. But surely there must be other books. Old books bound in dark leather filled with spells to bless her own looms and curse those of her rivals. How else could you explain her new blue dye? It wasn't chemistry. It was alchemy. The tipping point came during the bidding for the annual castle contract, a massive order to supply the Lord's household with all their fabric for the year. It was a prize that could make or break a workshop. The guild master, a pompous and powerful man named Ulrich, was certain he would win it. He was a man of status. But Greta, with her sharper numbers and superior product, quietly outbid him. The humiliation was public and profound. Ulrich couldn't accept that he had been bested by fair competition. That night in the tavern, his wounded pride curdled into righteous accusation. He spoke of unnatural dyes of looms that worked too fast of a woman who had clearly sold her soul for a commercial edge. Greta's witchcraft wasn't about sour milk or sick cows. It was a more sophisticated corporate kind of magic. She was accused of weaving curses into her rival's cloth to make it fray, of using enchantments to lure customers, of signing contracts, not with ink, but with a drop of blood. She had become a threat not just to the village's superstitious fears, but to its economic hierarchy. She was isolated by her own competence. The very success that should have earned her respect was now the primary evidence against her. Greta's magic was her brilliance, a quiet power that deeply threatened the men around her. But power doesn't always have to be so grand or so obvious. Sometimes the most dangerous power a person can wield is the simple, everyday magic of words. The power to argue, to complain, to lay a curse with nothing but a sharp tongue. And as we're about to see, that could be just as fatal as a balanced ledger. A sharp tongue. It seems like such a small thing. But in a world lit by fire and fear, words had a physical weight. A prayer could be a shield. A promise could be a chain. And a curse could be a sword. And here's the thing about words: unlike a balanced ledger or a secret knowledge of herbs, everyone has them. They are the great equalizer. The poorest farmer and the richest merchant can both wield an insult with devastating effect. Which brings us out of the workshop and into the chaotic, noisy, beating heart of any village, the market square. Let's set the scene. It's a loud, sprawling mess of humanity. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool, baking bread, sawdust, and the unmistakable aroma of unwashed bodies and livestock. Vendors are shouting, haggling is a sport, and everywhere there is friction. This is the stage for our next story, which isn't so much about one person, but about one single fatal interaction. On one side, we have Martha. She's a buyer. A mother of 5, her face etched with the permanent exhaustion that comes from trying to stretch a single coin to feed 7 mouths. She is stressed, tired, and feels the world is shrinking in on her. On the other side, we have Bridget. She's a seller presiding over a small stall of eggs and cheese. Her temper is as sharp as the knife she uses to cut her cheddar, worn thin by years of dealing with hagglers, thieves, and looky-loos. They were on a collision course from the moment Martha approached the stall. The argument started, as most do, over something laughably small. A handful of eggs. Martha claimed one was cracked. Bridget insisted it wasn't. "This one's broken," Martha said, holding it up. "It's a shadow woman now. Are you buying or browse?" Bridget retorted, her patience already gone for the day. The haggling escalated. Voices were raised. Insults were exchanged, each one a little more personal than the last. Martha accused Bridget of selling old goods. Bridget accused Martha of trying to swindle her. It was a miserable, thoroughly normal market day argument, the kind happening at a dozen other stalls at that very moment. It should have ended there, with both women storming off fuming, only to forget it by supper time. But it didn't. Pushed to her limit, her face red with fury, Bridget leaned over her stall. Her voice sharp and loud enough for half the market to hear cut through the din. "You begrudge me a halfpenny," she shrieked at Martha's retreating back. "Then may your own pot be as empty as your heart, and may your stew be as thin as your charity." And there it was. It wasn't a real curse. There was no ancient spell book, no pact with a dark lord. It was the medieval equivalent of telling someone to go step on a Lego. A blast of pure, uncut frustration given form by words. Nothing more. But words have echoes. Martha went home, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She couldn't shake the feeling of all those eyes on her. And she couldn't get Bridget's words out of her head. "May your pot be as empty as your heart." It played on a loop, the venom of it seeming to grow with each repetition. 2 days later, the family's only cow, Bessie, fell ill. She wouldn't eat. Her milk ran dry. It was a disaster. Bessie was their lifeline, milk, butter, cheese, the promise of a calf to sell. As Martha stood there, staring at the miserable, sick animal, her mind already primed and poisoned by the memory of the argument, made the connection. It was a spark jumping across a gap, igniting a devastating fire of certainty. The curse. It wasn't just an insult. It had worked. She ran to her husband. "It was Bridget at the market. She cursed us." The story spilled out, now transformed. Bridget's angry face became a mask of pure evil. Her shouted words became a whispered, deliberate incantation. The story did not stay within their cottage. Her husband told his brother at the tavern that night. The next morning, Martha told her neighbor over the fence while hanging laundry. The neighbor told the baker's wife. With each telling the story, grew. Bridget hadn't just shouted, she had pointed a crooked finger. She hadn't just cursed the stew, she had cursed the cow by name. By the end of the week, the entire village knew the truth. Bridget, the cheese seller, was a malicious witch who had attacked the poor, long-suffering Martha and her family. Bridget, meanwhile, was completely oblivious. She had forgotten the argument entirely. She went about her week selling her cheese, complaining about the weather, wondering why people were suddenly giving her a wide berth, their faces clouded with a fear she couldn't understand. She had no idea she had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, her life hanging by the thread of a few angry words she had long since forgotten. She was a witch, and she was the last to know. And so we have seen 5 paths. The healer condemned for her skill. The outsider condemned for her solitude. The farmer condemned by envy. The businesswoman condemned for her success. And now the market seller condemned for her temper. 5 different people, 5 different lives, all leading to the same terrible destination. It's a good moment to pause. To step back from these individual tragedies and feel the quiet, cold air that connected them all. Let's let the noise of the market fade and listen for a moment to the silence in between. And so we let the noise of the market fade. Let's listen for a moment to the silence in between. Just breathe. In and out. Imagine the sun has finally dipped below the hills. The sky is no longer a brilliant blue or an angry orange, but a deep bruised purple giving way to the velvet black of a moonless night. The air grows cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The frantic energy of the day has dissipated, leaving behind a profound and heavy stillness. This is the other side of medieval life. Not the shouting and the drama, but the immense quiet weight of the hours. In our modern world, we chop time into seconds and minutes, a constant frantic countdown. But here, time was a vast, slow-moving river, its currents marked only by the sun and the sound of a distant church bell. Listen, you can almost hear it now, a single bronze toll rolling across the sleeping fields. That could be the bell for Vespers, the evening prayer. Or later for Compline, the final prayer before true night begins. For the devout, this sound was a comfort, a reminder of God's unchanging order in a chaotic world. A sacred metronome pacing out their lives. But in a village gripped by a creeping fear, that same bell could sound very different. It wasn't a comfort. It was a deadline. Each toll wasn't a call to prayer, but a punctuation mark in a story of anxiety. It marked the time since the cow fell ill. It marked another hour that the strange old woman on the edge of town was left to her own devices. It marked the slow, inevitable arrival of another night when shadows grew long and the imagination was free to run wild. Fear is a patient seed. It doesn't always need the noise of an argument or the drama of a public accusation to grow. Sometimes it grows best right here in the silence. It's in the quiet moments sitting by the fire that the mind begins to wander and to wonder. A man looks at his meager harvest and doesn't just feel sad, he feels cheated. A woman hears a floorboard creak upstairs and doesn't just think it's the house settling, she thinks of a ghostly footstep. This is where the real work of the witch panic was done. Not in the courtroom, but in the quiet, fearful minds of ordinary people. It was a slow internal poison. It took the familiar world and twisted it just slightly until it was unrecognizable. The familiar became sinister. The normal became unnatural. The world became a stage for a secret war between good and evil, and absolutely everyone was a potential soldier for the other side. And as you sit here in this imagined quiet watching the embers of the fire glow, you start to notice things you missed in the chaos of the day. You notice the non-human world waking up as the village sleeps. You see the silent hunting flight of an owl against the star-dusted sky. You catch a flicker of movement in the alleyway and see a cat, maybe even a black one, moving with an unnerving grace through the deep shadows. And you start to wonder, are these creatures merely witnesses to the human drama? Or are they participants? Do they carry messages? Are they spies? In the stillness, you also notice the patterns of the world. You feel the shift in the wind and see the way the clouds gather before a storm. You remember the old farmer who can predict rain just by the ache in his knee. And you wonder how some people seem to know things before they happen. Is it wisdom born of long observation, or is it something else? A whisper from an unseen source, a forbidden glimpse into the machinery of the world. You hear that distant, powerful toll of the bell again, and you think about power itself. The power of the priest in his church, the power of the Lord in his castle. Their authority feels as solid and unquestionable as the stone they're built from. But what happens when someone dares to question it? What happens when a simple farmer argues with a priest over a few coins? What force pushes back when the powerless speak truth to the powerful? As the night deepens, the veil between worlds feels thinner. The world of dreams gets closer, a place of symbols and fears made real, of flying, of falling, of monstrous transformations. It's a private kingdom each of us visits every night. But what happens when someone claims to bring something back from that world? When their dreams spill into the waking day filled with prophecies and visions that unsettle the natural order of things? And finally, in the deep, deep quiet, you look from one cottage with its warm, flickering light to another dark and silent. And you think about the raw, simple, ancient power of wanting, of envy, of greed, a force older than any religion, more potent than any spell. The simple human desire to have what someone else has, or to take what isn't yours. A motive that needs no devil to explain it. All these thoughts, all these new seeds of fear and suspicion are here, waiting in the silence. But for now, the village sleeps. The fire burns low, a warm orange heart in the cool darkness. The world is still. Let the quiet hold you for a moment longer. Let it be a blanket, not a source of fear. Because the stories are not over. The whispers are just getting started. And in that deep silence, a new kind of story can be heard. Not one of grand accusations in a crowded market, but of quiet moments misinterpreted in the dark. In that deep listening silence of the night, you begin to notice the animals. The non-human world that moves with a purpose all its own. We asked if they were merely witnesses or if they were participants. Let's find an answer. Let's go back quietly to the window of Elara's cottage on the edge of the village. Let's peer through a crack in the wooden shutters and look inside. The fire is burning low, casting long, dancing shadows. And there, in the center of the room, is the heart of our next accusation. It's not a person, but a relationship. The bond between an old woman and her cat. Today, we call it having a pet. We buy them special food, we build them little houses, we talk to them in ridiculous voices. It's a normal, healthy part of human life. Back then, under the shadow of the Malleus Maleficarum, a close relationship with an animal, especially an animal like a cat, could be called something else entirely, consorting with a familiar. A familiar wasn't a pet. It was believed to be a demonic entity, a goblin, an imp, a minor devil, that had taken the form of an animal to serve a witch. It was less of a companion and more of a demonic intern. Its job was to spy, to carry out magical errands, and to act as a physical conduit for the witch's power. And the payment for its services was, according to the experts of the time, a third nipple from which it could suckle blood. The theology around this was, as you can imagine, disturbingly specific. So when a neighbor, let's call him Otto, peers through Elara's shutters, he isn't seeing a lonely old woman finding comfort in her cat Ash. He is an investigator watching a suspect consult with her supernatural accomplice, and everything he sees is filtered through this lens of terror. Inside, Elara is rocking slowly in her chair. Ash the black cat is a pool of shadow on her lap. She is stroking his back, her hand moving rhythmically. She is murmuring to him. "Ah, you're a good boy, aren't you?" She whispers, her voice raspy. "Yes, the only one who listens to this old woman's ramblings." Otto on the outside presses his ear closer to the crack. He doesn't hear the lonely, one-sided conversation of a woman starved for company. He hears a witch conferring with her agent. The words "good boy" are not praise. They are an acknowledgement of a mission completed. The ramblings are not ramblings. They are instructions for the next dark deed. Suddenly, Ash lifts his head. His ears twitch. He stares unblinking into a dark corner of the room. Elara stops rocking and looks where he's looking. "What is it, my little shadow?" she asks softly. "See a mouse?" Otto's blood runs cold. They are both looking into the corner. But the corner is empty. He can't see anything. But they can. Clearly, they are observing a visitor, another spirit that is invisible to his mortal eyes. The cat, the demonic lookout, has spotted an intruder. The fact that the intruder was probably a spider farting is irrelevant to Otto's investigation. Then Ash does something truly terrifying. He stretches, leaps silently from Elara's lap and lands on the floor without a sound. He then proceeds to walk across the room, his movements fluid and noiseless. To a modern eye, it's just a cat being a cat. To Otto, it's a violation of the laws of physics. Nothing should be that quiet. It didn't walk, it glided. It flowed like smoke. A clear demonstration of its unholy nature. Elara watches him go, a faint, sad smile on her face. To Otto, this is not a smile of affection. It's a smug, knowing smirk. The look of a master pleased with her servant. The final damning piece of evidence arrives a few minutes later. Ash, who had slipped out through a gap in the wattle and daub wall, slips back in. Clamped in his jaws is a small dead shrew. He trots proudly over to Elara and deposits this magnificent trophy at her feet, looking up expectantly. This is a behavior we now understand perfectly. The cat is acting on instinct, bringing its prey back to the den. It is in its own way a gesture of affection, a gift. But to Otto, this is the climax of the entire ritual. He has just witnessed a transaction. The familiar has returned from its dark errand with a sacrifice and offering. He sees the dead shrew not as a pest, but as a component for a spell delivered by a demon. Elara bends down, picks it up by the tail, and puts it in the fire. "Oh, you messy little hunter." She sighs. Otto stumbles back from the window, his heart hammering in his chest. He has seen enough. The case is closed. He has witnessed it all: the secret conference, the observation of spirits, the silent unnatural movement, and the ritual sacrifice. He doesn't see a lonely, poor-sighted woman with a bad back talking to her cat. He sees a powerful witch, a threat to the entire village, a conspirator with the forces of night. The case against Elara was built on things people could see, or at least things they thought they saw. A black cat, a strange glance, a dead mouse, tangible physical evidence twisted by fear. But what about the more dangerous magic? The kind you couldn't see at all, the magic of knowing things you shouldn't know, the quiet, unnerving power of knowledge itself, that we will soon find is a crime far harder to defend against. Knowledge. They say it's power. But in the 15th century, having the wrong kind of knowledge, or more accurately getting it from the wrong source, was a dangerous business. Official knowledge came from two places: the church and the nobility. It was handed down from on high. But there was another kind of knowledge, an older kind. The kind you learned with your own two eyes. The kind that was written not in books, but in the sky, in the behavior of animals, in the ache of your own bones. And that kind of knowledge was deeply suspicious. For this story, we leave the village behind and climb into the rolling hills that surround it. This is the domain of Jonas the shepherd. Jonas was a man who seemed to have been carved from the landscape itself. His face was a roadmap of seasons tanned by the sun and lined by the wind. His world was not one of people and gossip, but of vast silent skies, the endless nibbling of his flock, and the slow, patient rhythm of the turning year. He was a quiet man because there was rarely anyone to talk to, but he was not an ignorant man. In fact, he was one of the most knowledgeable people in the region. He had spent 50 years reading the only book that mattered to him, the Book of Nature, and he was fluent in its language. He knew, for instance, that when his sheep, for no apparent reason, began to huddle together in the middle of a warm afternoon, a bitter cold snap was on its way. He knew that when the smoke from a distant chimney fell to the ground instead of rising, the air was heavy and pregnant with rain. He knew the meaning of a mackerel sky, those high rippling fish-scale clouds that were a surefire promise of a great change in the weather. He wasn't a wizard. He was a scientist of observation. His mind was a vast collection of data points gathered over a lifetime of watching and learning. He wasn't predicting the future, He was reading the present with an expert eye. Unfortunately, to his neighbors down in the village, they looked like exactly the same thing. For years, his skill was a local curiosity. Ask Jonas if we should bring the hay in, a farmer might say. But it was always a bit of a joke, a folk custom, until the summer of the great storm. It was a hot, cloudless day in late July. The air was still and heavy. The farmers were working frantically to get the last of their hay cut and dried before it could rot. Jonas came down from his hills, his flock trailing behind him, and stopped by a field where 3 farmers were working. "You should get this in the barn today," he said, his voice calm, looking at the western horizon. "All of it." The farmers stopped, wiped the sweat from their brows, and laughed. "Look at that sky, old man," one of them said, pointing up. "There's not a cloud to be seen. You've been in the sun too long." Jonas just shrugged. "A storm is coming. A bad one." He gave a whistle to his dog and began herding his own flock towards the sheltered valley where they would be safe. The farmers shook their heads and went back to work, chuckling about the crazy old shepherd. 3 hours later, the sky turned a sickly, bruised green. The temperature plummeted, and then the heavens opened. It wasn't just rain. It was a violent, lashing thunderstorm with hail the size of acorns that shredded leaves from the trees. It lasted all night. By morning, the fields were a swamp, and the hay that the farmers had left out was a blackened, ruined, worthless mess. A year's worth of animal feed destroyed. When the farmers gathered, their faces grim, they were not talking about their own foolishness in ignoring a warning. That would be too simple, too direct an admission of fault. It's much easier on a man's pride, you see, to believe he was magically attacked than to admit he was just stubborn. And so their logic began its ugly defensive twist. Jonas hadn't predicted the storm. How could he? The sky was clear. No, he must have summoned it. His warning wasn't a kindness, it was a threat. His moving his own sheep to safety wasn't prudence. It was a culprit getting his own property out of the way before unleashing his dark magic. He hadn't just known, he had caused. The accusation needed more fuel, of course. A new rumor began to circulate, started by the farmer who had laughed the loudest. He swore he'd seen Jonas consulting a small tattered book up on the hills. Now maybe Jonas did have a book. Maybe it was a cheap almanac with planting dates. Maybe it was a few pages of the Psalms his mother had taught him to read before she passed. But in the fearful imagination of the village, this tattered book was transformed. It became a grimoire, a book of spells, a manual for calling storms and blighting fields. The evidence was now complete. Motive, some unknown grudge. Method, a spell from his book. Proof, the ruined hay. Jonas the shepherd. The quiet man of the hills was now Jonas the stormcaller, a malevolent weather witch. His wisdom gathered over a lifetime had been weaponized against him. He was a threat because he had access to knowledge without the permission of the priest. His crime was an indirect challenge to the established order of things. He knew the sky better than the men who claimed to know God's will. But what happens when the challenge is no longer indirect? What happens when a simple person doesn't just quietly know more than the authorities, but stands up and directly, openly questions them to their face? What happens when you challenge God's chosen representative in the village? That is a far more dangerous game to play. So what happens when you play that dangerous game? When the challenge is no longer indirect? What happens when a simple man stands up and directly, openly questions the authority of God's chosen representative in the village? That is a lesson our next character, a farmer named Konrad, learned the hard way. First, we need to understand the role of the village priest. Father Ulrich was not just a man who gave a sermon on Sunday. He was the most powerful figure in most people's lives. He held the keys to heaven and hell. He could grant absolution for your sins or excommunicate you, effectively making you a social and spiritual outcast. His word was quite literally the law of God. To challenge the priest was not to challenge a man, it was to challenge God himself. And God, it was well known, did not take kindly to being challenged. Our story begins as so many mortal conflicts do with money, or rather with grain. It was autumn, the harvest was in, and it was time for the collection of the tithe, the 10% tax on all produce owed to the church. It was a divine tax, and paying it was as much a spiritual duty as a financial one. Konrad was a man of simple principles. He was honest, hard-working, and he believed in fairness. He was also, unlike many of his neighbors, decent at math. Before the collection day, he had carefully counted his harvest. He knew to the sack exactly how much he had produced, and he knew exactly what 10% of that was. He set the sacks aside, ready for the collectors. When Father Alric's men arrived with their cart, they began loading the grain. But they took the sacks Konrad had set aside, and then 3 more. Konrad, wiping his hands on his trousers, approached them calmly. "There's a mistake," he said, his voice even. "The tithe is 10 sacks. You've taken 13. The lead collector, a brutish man who enjoyed his role, simply sneered. "The church's count is 13. Are you questioning the church?" "Konrad." "I'm not questioning the church," Konrad replied, his jaw tightening. "I am questioning your arithmetic. 3 of those sacks are mine." This was in the grand scheme of things a minor discrepancy, but it was the principle of it. Konrad was not a man who liked being cheated, not by a merchant and not by a priest. He stood his ground. The collectors, furious at this show of insolence, eventually threw the 3 sacks off the cart and left muttering threats. Konrad thought that was the end of it. He had been right, and he had stood up for himself. But you don't challenge a man like Father Alric and just walk away. The priest, hearing of Konrad's defiance, was incensed. It wasn't about the 3 sacks of grain. It was about the challenge to his unquestionable authority. He summoned Konrad to the church. The scene was set for maximum intimidation. The cavernous stone building, the smell of old incense, the light filtering through the high windows, illuminating a stern-faced Father Alric standing before the altar. Konrad, feeling small in the vast space, once again laid out his simple logical case. "Father," he said, "I had 100 sacks. The tithe is 10. It is simple math." Father Alric smiled, a thin, cold expression. "Ah, but you are using man's math, Konrad. The church uses God's math. And in God's math, we account for your immortal soul, for the prayers said for your harvest, for the protection granted by the saints." He leaned forward. "Or are you saying those prayers are worth nothing? Are you putting a price on God's benevolence?" And there it was, the trap. The argument was no longer about grain. It was about faith. To continue to argue was to admit he was a faithless man who didn't value God's protection. Konrad, a devout if stubborn man, was speechless. He was dismissed, defeated. A few weeks later, Father Alric caught a summer flu. He was in bed for 3 days with a fever and a cough. But from the pulpit the following Sunday, his voice still weak, he didn't speak of a common illness. He spoke of being spiritually afflicted. He said a darkness within the parish had lashed out at him, trying to silence God's servant. He never once mentioned Konrad's name. He didn't have to. The villagers, horrified that their priest had been attacked, did the math for him. Konrad argued with the priest. The priest fell ill. The conclusion was obvious. Konrad, furious at being outmaneuvered, must have resorted to a darker power. He had used witchcraft to strike the priest down. It was a brutally efficient piece of psychological warfare. The priest didn't have to make the accusation himself. He just supplied the ingredients: a public dispute and a timely illness, and the village baked the cake of condemnation for him. Konrad learned a valuable lesson in medieval economics: the church's math is always correct. He was now an outcast. People crossed the road to avoid him. His crops, they whispered, were surely raised with demonic help. He was a witch, a man who had dared to attack God. He hadn't stood a chance. His simple earthly logic had been defeated by a power that could literally redefine reality to suit its needs. Konrad's fight was with a power everyone could see and feel: the institutional authority of the church. But what about the powers no one can see? The ones that visit us in the dead of night, in the shadowy, untamed landscape of our own minds. What happens when the world of dreams bleeds into the waking world and someone claims to have seen things on the other side? That is a power that even a priest might fear. So what happens when the battleground is no longer the farm or the marketplace, but the shadowy, untamed landscape of the human mind? What happens when the world of dreams bleeds into the waking world and someone claims to have seen things on the other side? That is a power that even a priest might fear, because it's a power he can't control. Let's talk about dreams. Today we see them as our brain's nightly cleanup crew, a jumble of anxieties and leftover thoughts from the day. We might tell a friend about a weird dream, have a laugh, and forget it by lunchtime. But in the medieval world, the dreamscape was a very real place. It was a frontier where the soul could untether from the body and travel. It was a realm where angels could deliver divine messages and demons could whisper tempting lies. A dream wasn't just a story, it was a potential revelation. And having vivid dreams was like having a direct, unfiltered line to the supernatural world. A very dangerous thing indeed. This brings us to Anja. Anja was a young woman in the village, barely 16. She was quiet and unremarkable in her waking life, but at night, she lived a life of astonishing vivacity. She was a natural-born industrial-strength dreamer. When she slept, her mind didn't just flicker, it exploded into brilliant technicolor detail. At first, her dreams were a source of local entertainment. In a time when the only available pastimes were church chores and watching turnips grow, Anja's stories were a welcome diversion. She would sit with the other women while they were mending her eyes wide and recount her nightly adventures. She told them of flying over the patchwork of fields, of conversations with foxes who gave her cryptic advice, of visiting sprawling, impossible cities made entirely of salt and glass. The other girls would listen captivated. It was thrilling, a little strange, but ultimately harmless. She was just Anja, the girl with the funny dreams. The shift began subtly. The line between entertainment and prophecy began to blur. One day she told her friends about a particularly vivid dream she'd had. "I dreamt of the old footbridge over the creek," she said. "But it was sad. It was weeping great big tears of splintered wood." The other girls giggled at the strange image. A weeping bridge. But a few days later, after a heavy summer rain, the creek swelled into a torrent. The old rotting timbers of the bridge, long weakened by neglect, finally gave way, and the whole structure collapsed into the water. Suddenly, Anja's dream wasn't just a funny story anymore. It was a premonition. The villagers looked at her with a new kind of awe. She hadn't just imagined it. She had seen it. They didn't consider that maybe her subconscious had simply noticed the groaning sound the bridge made, or a crack in the main support beam that her conscious mind had ignored. No, the explanation had to be more magical. She had a gift. A second sight. Her status changed overnight. People desperate for some certainty in their uncertain lives started coming to her not for stories, but for information. "Anja, did you dream of the harvest? Will it be bountiful?" An old farmer would ask. "Anja, my mother is ill. Did you see her in your dreams? Did she look well?" A worried son would plead. She became a reluctant oracle. A shy, bewildered girl who was suddenly burdened with the hopes and fears of her entire community. She didn't understand it herself. The dreams just came, and the pressure to see to know was immense. And then she had the bad dream. It was a nightmare, plain and simple. She dreamt she was standing on the shore of the lake, and she saw a neighbor, a fisherman named Lars, out in his small boat. But the boat wasn't floating on water. It was floating on a sea of black writhing eels, and they were slithering over the side, filling the boat. She woke up with a gasp. Her heart pounding, the image seared into her mind. The dream scared her so much she made a mistake. She told her mother, and her mother, worried, told a neighbor, framing it as a concern. Anja had a terrible dream about poor Lars. The story spread as stories do. A week later, Lars went out to fish. A sudden violent squall blew in from the hills, the kind of unpredictable weather Jonas the shepherd might have warned about. His boat was capsized. They found his body washed ashore 2 days later, and the village turned on Anja in an instant. The logic was swift, brutal, and absolute. The dream wasn't a warning. How could it be it hadn't helped? No, the dream was the weapon. She hadn't foreseen his death. She had caused it. In the dark, terrifying theater of her own mind, she had reached out and pulled him under. She had dreamed him to death. The priest, hearing of this, declared her visions to be of demonic, not divine origin. She was a night witch, a soul stealer, who could commit murder from the safety of her own bed. Anja was now trapped. She was condemned for the very wiring of her own brain. The one place she had been truly alive, the world of her dreams, was now a crime scene. She became afraid to sleep, terrified of what her own mind might do, of who it might hurt next. Her incredible gift had become her own private, inescapable prison. Anja's crime was having a mind that was too open, too strange. But all the stories we've heard so far, they all had a reason, however twisted. A skill, a cat, a sharp tongue, a successful business, a strange dream. But what if there was no reason at all? What if the most dangerous accusation required no evidence, no strange behavior, no magic? What if the only ingredient needed was for someone to simply dislike you? Forget it all. Forget the black cats and the demonic familiars. Forget the strange dreams and the whispered incantations. Forget the sour milk and the storm summoned from a clear sky. We now arrive at the final and most terrifying reason you could be called a witch. We arrive at the cold, hard engine that drove so much of the witch craze hidden beneath all the theology and superstition. What if the only ingredient needed was for someone to simply dislike you? This is the most frightening reason of all, because it is the most human. It's the point where the accusation of witchcraft stops being a deeply held, if misguided, spiritual belief and becomes what it so often truly was, a tool, a weapon, a perfect, terrifyingly effective instrument for getting what you want with God and the law on your side. Let's be brutally honest for a moment. The Malleus Maleficarum and the witch panics it inspired didn't just give people a way to fight the devil. It gave them a divinely sanctioned, legally binding way to eliminate their rivals, to seize property, to settle old scores, and to punish those who had wounded their pride. It laundered ugly, mundane human motives through the language of holy justice. Let me paint you a few quick final pictures. Imagine two farmers, their fields separated by a stone wall. One farmer, Friedrich, has a small clear spring on his land, a priceless asset in a dry summer. His neighbor, whose own well is shallow, has coveted that spring for years. He has offered to buy the land. Friedrich has always refused. The neighbor sees Friedrich one day clearing weeds near the spring, muttering to himself about the ache in his back. A week later, the neighbor reports to the priest that he saw Friedrich performing a ritual at the spring, whispering incantations to the water spirits. The water's clarity, unnatural. It must be enchanted. The accusation leads to an investigation. The investigation, designed to find guilt, finds it. Friedrich is condemned. And his land, now the property of a convicted witch, is forfeited and sold, cheaply, to his neighbor. The accusation was a tool of greed. Imagine a young woman working in a tavern. She is admired for her beauty, but she is proud and carries herself with dignity. The son of a local merchant, a spoiled, arrogant young man used to getting his way, decides he wants her. He makes advances, crude, aggressive, public. She refuses him firmly and unequivocally, humiliating him in front of his friends. His ego is shattered, but a man of his standing cannot simply accept rejection from a tavern girl. So he creates a new story. He falls ill a week later with a stomach complaint. He doesn't say he drank too much stale ale. He says the girl, the tavern witch, looked at him with an evil eye and cast a spell on him out of spite. She didn't just reject him, she magically attacked him. He is no longer a spurned loser. He is the virtuous victim of a demonic temptress. She is no longer an innocent woman. She is a danger to all good Christian men. The accusation was a tool of wounded pride. Imagine two women who live next door to each other in the tight, crowded quarters of the village. Their families have been rivals for years. One woman's children are noisy. The other woman's chickens constantly get into her garden. One complains about the smell of the other's cooking. The other complains about the shadow cast by her neighbor's new fence. It's a litany of petty, everyday grievances that build and fester over years. There is no legal recourse. You can't have someone arrested for having annoying children, but the grievances build into a quiet, simmering hatred. And then one day, one of them sees an opportunity. A word whispered to the right person. You know, I've heard strange chanting from her house at night. It's a lie, but it's a powerful one. It's a nuclear option for a neighborhood dispute. It is a way to solve the problem of an annoying neighbor permanently. The accusation was a tool of pure, simple malice. Greed, lust, pride, spite. These were the true demons haunting these villages. Witchcraft was simply the holy pretext for these very unholy deeds. It was the acceptable face to put on the ugliest parts of human nature. It gave you permission to hate. It gave you a license to steal. It gave you the moral high ground from which to destroy someone's life. The great terrible irony is that for all the talk of supernatural evil and monstrous demons, the most dangerous monster in almost every one of these stories was the person living next door. The true horror wasn't an imaginary pact with the devil, but a very real conspiracy with your neighbors, your friends, and your own conscience. And so the circle closes. From the skilled healer to the lonely outsider, to the successful merchant, to the unlucky farmer, to the sharp-tongued seller, to the strange dreamer, and finally, to the simply disliked. We have walked 10 different paths and seen how each one, no matter where it started, led to the same dark destination. Each story was a single tragic thread. And now it is time to step back and see the entire terrible tapestry they weave together. And so we step back and look at this tapestry. It is dark, and it is woven with 1,000 threads of human suffering. Each story we've heard is a single thread in that design. There is the thread of Isolde the healer, a bright strand of skill and kindness that was punished for its own light. There is the thread of Elara, the lonely widow, a quiet gray thread of solitude that was misinterpreted as sinister secrecy. There is the thread of Heinrich's envy and Agnes's sharp tongue, a bitter green thread showing how easily misfortune could be forged into a weapon. There is the golden thread of Greta's success, a thread so brilliant and unconventional that it had to be snipped by the resentful shears of the men around her. There is the chaotic, angry thread of Bridget at the market, a testament to how a few hot words could ignite a fatal fire. There is the earthy thread of Jonas the shepherd, a story of quiet wisdom being condemned as an unholy challenge. There is the stark, iron-gray thread of Konrad's integrity beaten down by the unbendable self-serving power of a corrupt authority. There is the shimmering, ethereal thread of Anja's dreams, a fragile strand of imagination that the world couldn't handle, twisting it into a curse. And finally, woven throughout it all are the cold, black threads of simple human malice. The greed for land, the rage of rejection, the petty hatred of a neighbor. The stories with no magic at all, which makes them the most monstrous of all. When you look at it all laid out, you see the portrait that it paints. The witch was rarely a person. It was a category. It was an empty vessel into which an entire society poured its deepest, darkest fears. The fear of a changing climate and a failing harvest. The fear of disease and inexplicable death. The fear of knowledge that didn't come from the pulpit. The fear of women who held power whether through skill, wealth, or independence. And ultimately, the fear of their neighbors and the darkness they suspected lay within every human heart. The witch was a scapegoat for a world that felt chaotic and out of control. Finding a witch, blaming a witch, punishing a witch. It wasn't always about justice. It was about creating the illusion of control. It was a desperate, tragic attempt to find a simple answer to the unbearably complex question of why we suffer. It was in the end a story they told themselves to make sense of the dark. But these stories, these threads, belong to the past. They are heavy, and it is time to let them go. It is time to let the tapestry fade. And now, let the 15th century dissolve. Let the cold stone of the church and the rough wood of the cottages melt away into memory. Feel the room around you. Not a drafty, fire-lit hovel, but your room. Here, now, in this time, in this place of safety. The only crackling you hear now is the soft echo in your mind, or perhaps the gentle hum of your home. The flickering candlelight has been replaced by the steady, soft glow of a distant street lamp, or the simple, peaceful darkness of your own closed eyes. The cold, damp air that settled in the bones of Isolde and Elara is gone, replaced by the warmth of your own breath, the weight of your own blankets. In that world, every shadow was a threat, every whisper a potential accusation. But here in your bed, the shadows are just shadows. They are soft and harmless. The only whispers you might hear are the quiet sounds of your own home settling for the night. You are safe. There are no accusers at your door. There is no test to be passed, no judgment to be feared. All those people, Isolde, Greta, Jonas, Anja, and all the others, their struggles are over. Their voices are now just quiet echoes in the great silent library of history. We have listened to their stories. We have honored their memory. And now, we can let them rest. And we can let ourselves rest too. Feel your body growing heavy. Feel the softness of the pillow beneath your head. Feel the gentle pull of sleep, a current far kinder than any our stories have described tonight. You carry no one's envy, no one's suspicion, no one's fear. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to solve. All that is asked of you now is to release the day. Let go of the stories, let go of the thoughts. And in the quiet, in the warmth, in the safety of this present moment, just drift off to sleep.